One, welcome to, I can't even remember what day it is, day 7 or something like that of the conference officially. But we have only one roundtable, but one roundtable that I'm particularly fond of, I have to say, because it involves two students that I have really strong connections with, i.e. I'm the PhD mum, as we've decided the other day. So Mita did her PhD at Edge Hill University a few years ago. She now works at Middlesex University. Dipali is doing her PhD at the moment at Edge Hill University. Mita has looked in the past during her PhD at contemporary audiences watching Indian television serials on satellite television. So she was looking at CTV, etc. But today she really wants to dig back into her own experience of watching television as a young British Asian. You're talking about your childhood experiences, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Dipali is also looking back into her own experiences, but also primarily her parents' experiences of watching Indian cinema on British television and how that worked. So because that's a little bit earlier, we thought we start with Dipali. And Dipali is just going to give us a little bit of an opening statement, and we will watch some clips, and then Mita will take over also with an opening statement, and then we'll watch another clip. And then, I'll ask a few questions, and it would be great if you also came in and asked your questions. Brilliant. So Dipali, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elke. Okay, so for me, television was so many things. An educator, a dear old friend, a member of the family, familiar and at times frustrating. But above all else, it was a magical piece of apparatus which provided a connection and understanding to the world outside my home. Uh, as the world inside my home was a slightly chaotic but caring Hindu Bengali household and something that was rarely seen on TV. Even as a youngster, uh, I knew this because when we did see a brown person on television in the 70s and 80s, it was a massive deal. And no exaggeration that all the family would gather around and look at someone who looked like us. Be it Dino Shafiq in It Ain't Half Hot Mum or Jamila Massey in Mind Your Language, as two examples. As I mentioned at the outset, television helped me make sense of the world, and I accepted much of what I saw, regardless of the genre, as a form of realism. And despite problematic and negative representations of South Asians in later years, I wondered why these racist comedies didn't affect me as much as they could have. And there's two main reasons. Firstly, when you're dealing with racism on a regular basis in real life, the stuff on television becomes slightly innocuous. Secondly, and most importantly, it was my parents' love of films, and in particular Indian films, which I watched from a young age on pirate videos, and they presented a well-rounded and varied representation of Asians, providing me with a positive sense of self. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of the negative stuff was internalized because growing up, and I use this phrase hesitantly, person of color in Britain at the time was inevitable. And but I cannot emphasize enough how escaping into the films from my heritage and my culture really took the edge off. So every few months, my dad would disappear to some mysterious location, return with a hired VCR and several videos, and we would watch them back to back within the allocated 24 hours, binge watching old school. It was important, and I knew it was a special event because even my mother, who worked from home as a machinist, stopped working at the sewing machine. In 1987, a program came along which changed my life forever. It was called Movie Mahal. It presented and discussed Indian films in a way which I'd only seen applied to films from the West. Primarily, it would be Barry Norman on his film review program. Um, but what I've realised is in the early days, the BBC didn't take our films seriously. And although it was the first channel to broadcast an Indian film, Amar Akbar Anthony, in 1980, their actions displayed a few cultural insensitivities. Firstly, their clumsy editing, where it started with the opening credits and missed out the 20 minutes of the film which explained what was happening, so causing the plot to become disjointed and confusing. So if you were a person coming to this film new, it just didn't make any sense. And also, bizarrely, they removed many of the songs which are an integral part of South Asian films. So a couple of comparators in terms of films from the West. I looked up on BBC Genome, and because I was thinking there has to be long Western films, and what did they do with those? So Gone with the Wind, 3 hours and 44 minutes, 40 minutes longer than Amar Akbar Anthony. And lo and behold, the BBC split it into two and showed it over the Christmas period. I think it was Boxing Day and the next day after that, over 2 nights. And then Once Upon a Time in America, a whopping 4 hours and 11 minutes, was shown in its entirety on Film 4. So, do you know what? It can be done. And I'm pretty sure if they'd been cut or hacked, they would have been up front. So that's just sort of a very basic comparison. So Movie Mahal was also groundbreaking for me because it provided subtitles. The videos that I watched with my parents had nothing. So I was just trying to, as a young person, figure it out and asking annoying questions to my parents, like, what's going on? So Nasrin Muni Kabir, the director of Movie Mahal, approached these films with respect and seriousness, something which I'd gleaned from my parents anyway years ago, but here was Channel 4 confirming this. The Indian films were curated and presented in such a way it was made known to the viewer, regardless of their background, these films were important and you needed to know about them. Finally, this PhD might never existed as it just came about due to a chance conversation with my mother, who obviously I talk to all the time. But it was during my master's that Elke was my supervisor, and I was watching an old film, Achat Kanya, from 1936. And Mum was like, oh, I've never watched it. So I was like, well, I have to watch it. And it's probably the 7th time I was watching it. I was like, watch it again with me. And suddenly out of the blue, she's like, I recognize this song. I've seen it before. And I was like, where on earth have you watched this before? And she mentioned Naya Zindagi, Naya Jeevan. Now, I remember this program for, it was quite serious and quite, for a young person, it was very much like talking, but then the musical interactions and inserts were the thing that everyone tuned in for, especially the South Asian communities. But I'd never remembered any film clips, but she definitely saw it on Naya Zindagi. And that got me thinking, how many other films had been shown on British TV before the digital revolution came along? And if you didn't have access to a video guy or a cinema, if there was a large South Asian community, where did you go? What did you do to watch Indian films? It set off many trains of thought: film on TV, on British TV, scheduling, selections, editing. I was talking about this recently, and someone very kindly described it as, I described time scheduling as a form of soft censorship. And I was like, oh yeah, I did, didn't I? So also it got me thinking about the very rare occurrence, which was leisure time, especially for first generation British Asian women who spent very little time outdoors, to be honest, and has rarely been documented. You've got Roger Ballard with Deshpal Desh, Wilson with Find Your Voice, and Tinker with the Banyan Tree, who've recorded some iconic, groundbreaking texts about the South Asian communities when they first came to Britain. But film and TV have generally been overlooked, especially with regards to the experiences of the first generation migrants. So on that note, I'd just like to share a couple of clips. So I've become very familiar with Trilt lately. With it's the Television and Radio Index for Learning and Teaching, and I was amazed to find that there are a few listings, not many, but a few listings of some of the films that were shown on Naya Zindagi. So Elke, for sharing, I don't know what to do. So would you do it if I put the PowerPoint up?
Yeah. So you would have to share the PowerPoint via email to me.
Or do I open the share tray? Would that work?
Yeah, you open the share tray.
Yeah.
Make sure that you click sound button, include computer sound.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it should work. Sorry, you should have tried that before.
We're all friends here.
Yes. We can hear the music.
Can you hear it?
Yeah, but we can't see anything.
Oh.
Share screen, but also share computer sound.
Right. Can you see this one?
No,
Nothing?
yeah.
No. Okay, here we go.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Is it visible now?
Yeah. So you just need to move, obviously, to your presentation, and then it should work.
Okay. Here we go. So this is a clip from Naya Zindagi. So that is what I remember as a youngster of seeing live performances. But then on Trilt, it actually confirms that this clip was actually this film clip was actually shown. Okay, and then finally a short clip from Movie Mahal. And as I said, the fact that it had subtitles was incredible, but also there was a lot of little pieces of information, such as the directors and the years. So just having all those details, and as a history geek, I just love that there was all these facts scrolling along the screens for you to learn more about the film in a non-intrusive way. So here we go. So that was Dilip Kumar and Mumba's Rafi singing for a moment, and there was Cuckoo dancing, and you saw Raj Kapoor and Nargis as well. So thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Is it over to me now?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Has it gone away? Yes.
Yeah.
So hello everybody. So I'm Mita, and I don't have anything prepared as well as Dipali has, but I will concur with a lot of what Dipali said, in the sense that television in my household was the babysitter growing up. So being from a working class South Asian, Indian, Hindu, Gujarati speaking family in the northwest of England, where the community was quite small. So in Preston, we didn't have the kind of communities that you find in places like Leicester or Birmingham or in places like Southall. So it was quite a small community. Everybody knew everybody. And like Dipali said, being, I suppose, like, like second generation, and being a woman as well, being a girl, you weren't really allowed out. And so, you know, television was my go-to. So television and me personally have had a very long history. So, and I adore television, absolutely adore it. It's like the second member of the family, you know what I mean? Like, that was when I moved house, that was the first thing that I set up, you know, like my partner set up his computer, I set up the television. So this is how important television is to me anyway, personally. And so my research, what I looked at was older Indian women from my community and kind of their consumption of Indian soap operas that are found on transnational channels like Star Plus, ZTV, Colours, you know, those kind of digital channels. But alongside that, I also did look at the history of their consumption of television. And even within this kind of small group of women, older women, these are first generation women who came over either from East Africa or from India itself, some of them twice diasporic. For the majority of them, their experience of television was British television. They'd never had access to television until they arrived in the UK. So this is kind of one thing that I kind of started to delve into, and I started reading around, you know, Marie Gillespie's work, but also work by Chris Barker, and thinking about how they'd explored first and second generations consumption of television. And I started to reflect on my own experiences of television with that as well. And I kind of started to think like, well, I didn't experience what they're finding. Some of it was familiar. Some of it I kind of was like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember watching Neighbours and thinking about, you know, why, thinking about how lucky they were to have boyfriends and girlfriends, and watching you know, America during the summer, you had like American teenage high school dramas being broadcast during the week, you know, and everyone having boyfriends and girlfriends. That was kind of the main, that whole romance type thing was very much the thing that I kind of focused on. Probably also because of the Bollywood relationship as well, although it wasn't Bollywood at the time. So my experience of television is really quite varied. On the one hand, it was very, very much the 4 channels that we had on terrestrial television in the UK: BBC One, BBC Two, ITV and Channel 4. And like Dipali, anytime anyone who looked like me, who looked like us, came on television, and you know, it'd be everyone gathered around the television, you'd hear shouts from upstairs, quick, we're on TV, come and have a look, you know, mum would be on the phone to her sisters, quick, turn on BBC One, and that kind of thing. And it was a real joy to see ourselves on television, because then you'd think like, oh, I wonder why they're there, I hope it's nothing negative. And you know, it would be kind of quite fascinating. And so the original paper that I was going to do for this conference was actually called Aprawara are on TV, you know, people like us are on television, because this is the abiding memory. And I've seen and I've heard people from kind of the people from black communities as well say the same thing. And it's quite interesting how this kind of is transcending a lot of the minority communities that are in the UK, where, you know, we're always happy to see ourselves on TV, and that it was something to be kind of celebrated. Sorry, I'm kind of going off tangent here. So my experience with television has been, I don't know what, it's been great, but I'm kind of babbling here and I'm not quite sure why. So what I found in the reading around Chris Barker and Marie Gillespie was that a lot of the experiences that they recorded in their research didn't necessarily reflect mine, particularly when it came to Asian programming. When in 1989, BBC Two started to broadcast the Hindi serial the Mahabarata, which was the dramatization of Hindu mythological text on the BBC, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I didn't like it. I didn't know what was going on, didn't understand the language, being forced to record it. And I was like probably about 10 at the time. Didn't like it at all. However, fast forward like 10 years later, and my younger brother, for some reason, one summer decided to kind of sit down and watch it, because we had the VHS recordings of this. Anytime a film came on television, we would record it, and my parents still have the VHS recorders as evidence of this. And so 10 years later, my brother and I don't know why, we kind of sat down and watched them all. And this time I actually got into it. I was like, oh, okay, I can see why my mum and dad really liked it. I can see why the entire community would spend like ages talking about it. You know, in the temple, even the priest would talk about it. It was really a big event for us in our community in Preston. But then similarly to Dipali as well, what I didn't realise at the time, but my parents were also hiring out pirated videos, but it weren't necessarily just films. There was also television programmes that my parents were able to get hold of, particularly prior to the Mahabarata being made by the Indian national broadcaster Doordarshan. There was the Ramayana. That wasn't broadcast in the UK. But my parents watched it through pirated videos. And I remember going to the video man's house and my parents trying to negotiate like when the next episodes, because obviously you've got to watch it in sequence. So they were like, oh no, this guy's got it, he'll bring it back tomorrow. Why don't you take this one for now, and then you can have this one tomorrow, you know, trying to figure out how to get the next episodes. So this is kind of a really quick background as to what the life of me and television really, and also specifically Indian Asian programming on terrestrial television. And then it was probably kind of like in the late 80s, early 90s that you had things like Network East coming on our screens. So this was more an English language program, but all about kind of South Asian culture, whether it was Sikh culture, Hindu culture, Muslim culture. And I think it also kind of encompassed regions as well as Pakistani, Bangladeshi and Sri Lankan cultures as well. So it was great because you got to see your favorite song and dance sequences for films. There was a little bit about fashion, there was a little bit about kind of news in general, but you know what I kind of kept picking up from in terms of my research was that how a lot of these programs weren't scheduled within the kind of main body of the television schedule, if that makes sense. What I mean is that, you know, the films that were being shown on Channel 4 or on the BBC, they were on at 1 o'clock in the morning. The magazine program that Dipali showed that was broadcasting from the 60s into the 70s, and then it kind of changed its name in the 80s. That was shown, you know, 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, for example. So they weren't part of the, you know, the actual, you know, the main schedule. You know, it was outside of what Raymond Williams' idea of flow. And so I found that like really interesting. But at the same time, my participants, or at least a couple of them, kept referring to these programs as our programs. They were like taking ownership that these were my programs for me and for our community. And that I thought was quite interesting, because there was this I found the way that kind of language that they used of ownership about these programs really interesting. But I'm going to kind of stop there, and I'm happy to, and like, let's open it up to questions and talk about this in more detail through a Q&A. I think I know I've rambled, but you know.
Shall we watch the clip quickly?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So this is the program that I sent a quick email about yesterday, which is currently available on the iPlayer. So as we're all in the UK at the moment, now Dr. Panita won't be, all the better, because she gets to see what British UK television is like, but made for Asian audiences. And I found it really interesting from my point of view, if I may say that I watch these programs all the time. Yeah, the back in time programs. I'm a bit of a history buff as far as television is concerned. I like my history on television, and it wasn't pushed at me, which I thought was really sad. You know, I'm a regular user of the iPlayer. Let me make sure that I'm in the right place. Sorry. So that surprised me. And then what also surprised me, I hope this is working. Yes. What also surprised me was one thing that we're going to talk about a little bit as well. I think how this program compressed the history too much in a way. There's not enough space to develop it. Okay, here you go.
This year, Sharma Stores has extended its product range and its customer base.
Hello.
Hi kids, how are you?
Doing good. How about you?
Brilliant. What would you like?
Can I get one packet of Skips, one packet of Wotsits, and a tube of Smarties?
Yeah, well, you get the Smarties, whichever one you want.
Okay, thanks.
And there's that on this one.
Cool. There you go.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you have a lovely day, all right?
With Vish on shop duty, Manisha and Alicia are finally getting to make the most of their new colour telly.
You remember how we made custard? The way we make the cheese sauce for cauliflower cheese is very similar.
By 1975, Birmingham was famous for producing one of the nation's favourite TV shows, Pebble Mill at 1.
When I was working in London, there was a standing joke that the North began at Potter's Bar.
But the studio was also home to a bigger and more ambitious Asian programming unit.
I rather want to try one of theirs tomorrow. We will in a minute.
I've sent broadcaster Samira Ahmed to talk to Manisha and Alicia about the significance of the programmes made there.
Hello. Hi, Samira, come in.
Thank you.
Samira's mum was a journalist, appearing on several of the shows made by the APU.
Ginger and we had British rule for over 300 years. And of course, Christmas was accepted as one of the great festivals.
You know, when I was a kid and my mum was doing Indian programming, I went once with her to a recording at Pebble Mill, and I was really struck by the fact that the presenters and the guests all speaking Hindustani, and all the crew were English and didn't understand a word of it, but it didn't matter. And I remember being made to feel really at home. And I suppose it had a real impact on me, where I felt television was for all of us.
In 1975, South Asian families across Britain would drop everything and tune into magazine show Naya Zindagi, Naya Jeevan, or New Life. Where previous programmes had aimed to educate and help South Asians assimilate into Britain, New Life was an unabashed celebration of traditional culture.
They're beautifully shot and staged, and I guess it makes you think of something like the Old Grey Whistle Test. You know, there's kind of a reverence about this is seriously good music and major musicians. So you're seeing, you know, artistes in their prime.
South Asian women pull off blue and green eyeshadow. It looks so good on her.
But you can imagine like parents and grandparents watching this. It would have been a feel-good factor, a taste of home, maybe, and just something that's on television that feels like, okay, we can relate to this directly to us.
With just 3 TV channels to choose from, New Life attracted plenty of accidental fans.
I have all these memories of meeting my white friends who remember turning this on, and they love the theme music, and because they were intrigued by this world of Asian culture.
Showcasing the best of, you know, South Asian talent and showing this country that there's so much beauty to it.
It was amazing meeting Samira and getting a feel for what it must have been like to watch TV back in the day.
Naya Zindagi, Naya Jeevan. I know that my own in-laws were really pleased that that was on. That was their slot of half an hour to watch people speaking, seeing famous people, musicians, artists. It was all spoken in their mother tongue. I think you would have felt really proud of that.
Can I just quickly point out as well that some of those clips kind of highlight the almost classical nature of Indian music. So it's later in Network East, you kind of got the bit more poppy side because the music in films did change. But during that time, there was still an emphasis on a lot of kind of classical tropes to the music, you know, with the sitar and the tablas and the harmoniums, you know, almost kind of Ravi Shankar-esque, which I've kind of noted. So there is this almost kind of highbrow element to some of those, especially those clips that they showed in the program. I wasn't entirely familiar with the whole of that magazine program because I don't know if those are in the archives. But yeah, I kind of, this is something that I picked up on, that there was the very kind of highbrow classical aesthetic and you know, kind of feel to a lot of that music that they showed there. So yeah, so I just kind of wanted to take a minute and point that out.
Actually, that's a good point to make, and I wonder if Dipali wants to comment on that, because that struck me about Movie Mahal as well, that, you know, there were so many old films being shown rather than contemporary Indian cinema of the time.
Yeah, I mean, not to give away my age, I am slightly older than Mita, I think, but I do remember by the early 80s, when it was coming to its end, there was a bit of the sort of the disco stuff going on, and they did have there was this brilliant duo. It's like a bit like the Carpenters, a brother-sister duo, and they sang some brilliant disco tunes. And like, I mean, Samira mentioned the Old Grey Whistle Test. I would have likened it to Top of the Pops because that was my thing. So, but yeah, definitely it was very much more the classical music and the sort of old school stuff, because I guess it was catering towards my parents' generation. And I would say I'm first generation, obviously, because I came here when I was 1.5, but I totally grew up in a British culture. But yeah, and also that thing of, it felt like Indian culture was always a little bit behind, especially in popular culture. So when disco was coming out here in the West in the 70s, 5 years later, they'd be wearing the flares and doing the John Travolta poses and whatever. So, but yeah, with Movie Mahal, it was, again, the focus was on that sort of golden era that everyone sort of talks about, the 50s and the 60s, and it was tailing off by then. By the early 70s, mid-70s, parallel cinema was coming in. There was a harsher edge to it, and there was more sort of veering towards blockbusters and sort of the big sort of like explosions, and like, I'm becoming slightly more male orientated in terms of leads, because for sure in the 50s and 60s there was much more equality in terms of the female and male characters and their roles and representations. So, and I wonder, again, it's that thing of celebrating obviously this brilliant period of cinema and celebrating, like they said, Asian culture, But with just referring back to the Back in Time programme, I did find it very surprising, Elke, when you said that they didn't, with all the algorithms and stuff, that should have definitely been on your to-watch list. And I have to say, I don't know how Mita found it, but when I started watching the first episode, I turned it off 2 or 3 times because it was just so infuriating. I was like, why are they explaining this? Why are they like stating the obvious? And I had to keep getting to, it's not for you. It's not for you. I was like, well, who is it for? Oh, it's not for me. Right. So it's supposedly explaining it to white British audiences, I guess. But then Back in Time for Tea and Back in Time for the Victorians, that wasn't explained for me. That wasn't like on my behalf. But I just felt like it was it just felt a bit too rose tinted, a bit too sort of celebratory. And I get it, there should be a positive, and it should be like sort of like, look at the amazing things Black and Asian communities have done by coming to this country, and look what we've done and changed the fabric of society and whatever. But at the same time, there was so much dark stuff that was overlooked, I feel.
Yeah, that's actually interesting, because obviously the racism is mentioned at one point, or twice actually. However, I was wondering, you know, I felt it went over it far too quickly, considering, you know, the complexity and actually also the experience of it. I mean, you've referred to Dipali. What do you think? I mean, I assume that the issue of racism didn't come up in the older programs either, did it?
It touched upon it, which I found extremely surprising. Like I say, I've lived in Britain since the 70s and the 80s, and it's just like, you know what? It was, I'm not exaggerating, it was there all the time. And it's like, maybe I grew up in the north, like Mita, I was in a northern working class town, and there was a proper, I have a love-hate relationship with my hometown Burnley, because you had properly like sound people who were so lovely, and then you had like extremists and National Front guys trying to kick down your doors and stuff, and it's just like, I felt the BBC, they touched upon it, and I'm not sure who, there was a different director and producer for each episode, so it's difficult to navigate who was presenting what perspective. But fundamentally, you had a person from EastEnders, I forget his name, sorry.
Nitin Gayatri?
Possibly. Do you know what? He was really like sort of very matter of fact, just telling a story about how his parents owned a shop and how NF guys and skinheads would be beating him up and kicking his head in with Doc Martens. And they just sort of sanitized it slightly by bleeping out what he was saying. Yeah, it's offensive language. It might be upsetting to some viewers, but I think that stuff needed to be heard, because it wasn't a one-off. So many people experienced it. And yeah, maybe you don't want to hear about it, but this stuff, if you have an opportunity to discuss it and just tell an audience who may not be aware or know about it, just how we had to live life in that period.
That sounds good. But what about Naya Zindagi and programs like that? Did they ever raise the issue of racism?
See, that's the thing. I'm slightly too young to remember it properly, but I from what I've read on the sort of program descriptions, they did do things like go to conferences, and it may sound a bit dry, and you can imagine like a child going, oh, who wants to watch this? But I think they did try. I think they interviewed Margaret Thatcher at one point. You know what I mean? And so, but I don't know if they talked to her about, because she echoed the language of Enoch Powell in the earlier days about Britain being swamped and flooding and all of that stuff. So they might have touched upon it. But when sort of significant events were happening, which were connected, associated to South Asian communities, they definitely would have that journalistic approach. But I can't say for definite any matters on racism. They would obviously go and talk to the youth and talk to community leaders, but I can't say specifically.
Christine, do you want to ask a question? You're muted.
Okay, that better?
Yeah.
Yes, good, at last. Okay, that was really interesting. Thank you both so much. And I think your personal accounts of your engagement with your own areas and British, what happened in Britain and also with television are really interesting and vivid. But I just wondered whether you might both like to talk a little about how you relate that personal accounts to a more academic mode where you can make more general comments about television operating in these communities at whatever time you're looking at.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, so I'll try. So I think doing my research and looking at this older group of women has led me to think about my experiences more, but how I'm still trying to think about how to consolidate my experiences with an academic angle, because I understand, you know, this idea of like, you know, people have talked about how memory is, you know, thinking about memory and people's memories is problematic. But then I'm kind of thinking about it from an autographic perspective. And it might be that I don't focus necessarily on those past experiences, but maybe use them to inform my contemporary experience of television in an autoethnographic way, if that makes sense.
I mean, there are obviously cultural studies, you know, leads very much in that direction. So I'm not saying you're doing anything unique in a way, but it is just how you get that balance between the personal and more general evidenced accounts has to be negotiated.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think also part of this is also to kind of broaden our colleagues' understanding of what it was like as an experience from someone like, from my perspective, watching EastEnders, watching Coronation Street, watching Beta Grove, Blue Peter, you know, Top of the Pops. And so just to kind of, you know, it might not necessarily be something for me, but it might be that a colleague reaches out to me and says, look, Mita, I'm doing this. Would you like to be involved? Can I, you know, could you be a participant in my research around EastEnders or something? So I think it's also a bit of that as well, Christine. I think this is what my angle as well, in that I want to share with my colleagues that this was my experience, and I do want to look at it from an academic angle, but I also want my experience to be out there because it might be helpful for your research as well. And I am a willing participant. If anyone wants to interview me, send me a survey. I'm available.
I wanted to raise quickly here as well that in our pre-meet, we were really strongly discussing actually these experiences of reading, you know, Mary Gillespie's account, and we were talking about how there seemed to be very little published about these experiences, and then we were kind of saying, oh, but actually, you know, when Morley talks about the shopkeepers in his nationwide studies, what were the shopkeepers in Birmingham, who were they from? Where he calls them working class, but they were probably British Asian working class, right? But Dipali and Mita are both from basically the north of England, and the north of England has a different makeup to some extent, particularly when it's small town, and that in a way was really interesting because we were talking about that. Dipali, did you want to come into that in that regard?
I guess just to add on a little bit about, I suppose, the sort of academic approach, because that's what it's all about fundamentally. For me, it was with discussions with Elke, it was Indian. So there's a lot of stuff about film on TV generally, but there was barely anything, Christine, of Indian cinema on television pre digital and satellite channels, and that was really surprising. And the fact that it was just overlooked and not taken serious, I think that was a big thing as well. Even within academia, South Asian writers, particularly in the UK, would just be a bit sort of Sarita Malik talks a little bit about it, but it's more television rather than cinema or film. And so I guess it was not only the lack of academic discussion about Indian cinema on British television, but also the reception of it, and not so much and from the people who watched it at that period. So initially I was thinking it would be autoethnographic, but clearly it's not, because it's happened. So that whole approach of trying to record their memories and experiences, because it's really been overlooked, and there's very little. I mean, like you said, Morley has done some stuff, but more from a working class perspective, which applies to lots of Asian communities. But Gillespie, she looked more with the younger sort of communities. But with that first generation, and because they're dying and they're losing their memories, there's just very little out there which needs to be recorded. And that's hopefully my plan during this PhD.
Great. Rachel, you have your hand up.
I have. The first thing to say is that I'm working off a hotspot on my phone, so I do apologise if the connection's really poor. Mita and Dipali, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your experiences of television in this panel today. And I wanted to pick up on something that you said, Dipali, at the beginning of your presentation, which was about your memories of watching those kind of 70s sitcoms like Mind Your Language and It Ain't Half Hot Mum, and the experience of seeing brown people on television, and how that was mitigated, the potential impacts of that were mitigated for you by the film culture that you was also available to you at that time. And this is a question about pedagogy in a way, and how we teach television history, because I have attempted to teach those programs on occasions, not very successfully, I would say. Teach them from my perspective, like in a way like you, they, as a child growing up in 1970s Britain, a white child, they were my only experience of seeing brown people at all. And you know, they're potentially very damaging representations, of course. So while you've been talking, I've been thinking about how valuable the way you contextualized your viewing of those programs is potentially for enabling us to teach historical television that's perceived quite rightly as really problematic, but which at the same time we don't want to ignore and pretend did not happen, because actually programs like Love Thy Neighbour have a lot more of interest in them alongside the really problematic representations. So I just wanted to invite both of you really to reflect on, you know, is there a way in which we can teach those programs that might draw on the experiences of academics like yourselves and your own histories with British television? I'm sorry that's not very carefully formulated, but I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. So I guess I'll just say briefly, when one of the great things about being at Edge Hill was especially Elke, a lot of the lecturers were quite open to discussions, and as an older person as well, I would just query a lot of things, but they said questions are a good thing, so that's all good. But we did a genre for one of the modules, and it was comedy, but I was like, but where are all those 70 sitcoms? And clearly you can only cover so much in a like 10-week module. But I did speak to, I think it was Hannah, who was running it, and I was like, what? And the thing is, it was interesting because I spoke to a couple of lecturers and they sort of cringed, and they were like, ooh, why do you want to talk about that? Ooh, why do you want to even like go there? I was like, I need to. So basically I went and created this like essay title, and there's something about the ambivalence of it all, that whole thing about oh my goodness, we're on TV, this is fantastic. Oh, this is not a good representation. And it's like, fundamentally, is some crappy representation better than no representation? And so the essay I was trying to formulate is like, yes, we were put on TV, but we were put on TV by loads of middle-aged white guys writing the script, producing it and directing it. But then that whole thing about, you have a woman like Jamila Massey who was there in a sari, knitting and wearing a cardi, looking like my mother, and I was like, that's so good. So it's that whole thing of like, you can't just ignore it though, just because it's offensive, just because it's negative and it doesn't work with our aesthetics and our sort of sensibilities in present day. It still needs to be looked at. And like Elke, I am a massive fan of historical TV because you learn so much from it, and to ignore it, especially in academia, would be a massive, it would be a massive loss, because it's that stuff that has to be discussed, and we need to get more kids, Black Asian kids, in academia, especially around film and TV as well. And if you've got that module, if they've got stuff like that to discuss and talk about their experiences, it's such a brilliant opener to get them in there. So.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Mita, do you?
Yeah, like, so I think I don't remember these representations. And so I
You're
think,
not old enough.
No, I'm not. I'm old, but I'm not that old. Because I think the other thing is like, what are you trying to teach them? I think that's another question, right? So I think, yeah, we've definitely got to talk about it, and kind of look at the comedy, but then also look at the different people that are represented within those comedies. What's the one with Don Warrington in it as well? From oh god, I can't.
Rising Damp.
Yeah, Rising Damp as
Rising
well.
Damp.
You know, with that kind of like discussion. So I think it kind of goes across the board, the broad there. Put my teeth back in. So yeah, I think we need to talk about them, but I think it's also, well, what are we trying to say? Are we saying like, look, there is this representation, yes, it's negative, but let's put it from a perspective of an audience who has not seen anything like this on television so far? You know, so I think if we teach it from an audience perspective, but also from a genre text perspective, I think you're going to get two different. I think my advice would be, this is me giving Rachel advice, oh my god, I would say, like, cover it from two angles. Cover it from the text angle, from the production side and the textual and the narrative side, and you know, the issues that it's problematic and the representations are problematic. But then we've also, and this is also something I'm learning as well, is that from the audience perspective as well, you know, that negotiated reading that is taken, and you know, by all means use this recording as a learning tool for the students, and give my response and Dipali's response as that. You know, like, I loved, goodness gracious me, I'm kind of the era of good Desmond's. Oh my days, Desmond's was amazing. You know, whole black cast, you know, that was brilliant. And you know, goodness gracious me and all that. So I kind of became like, it wasn't as, there was still negative representations. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know the positive ones, or the ones that I really remember and really liked, were those Desmonds. And you know, I think my mum watching, because she watched a lot of soap operas, and you know, the EastEnders families, the Coronation Street families. Emmerdale didn't have any, I don't think Brookside did, but yeah, those kind of families. So yeah, so my kind of memories are more of from soap operas rather than comedies, but I hope that's kind of, you know, helped in some way.
So helpful. I mean, to answer your question, I've always tried to teach those programs as kind of contextualized in the wake of Enoch Powell, and like the kind of like
Right.
early 70s perspective. But it just, as you were both talking, I just suddenly saw a completely different way of teaching them, and I was just really interested to hear what you thought about that. So that's incredibly helpful. Thank you both very much.
Very welcome. And also helpful for my teaching as well.
Yeah, great. Kevin has put into the chat that he's put, or he's collecting some material on cooking shows, and that includes something about Samira Ahmed's mother, Lalita, and there's even a thread that we can all look up, and a Twitter thread, which we can click through if we want via the chat. Richard, I saw you were typing. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, sorry. I'm in a coffee shop, so again, usual apologies for the connection. I think I was just kind of responding to the whole panel, really, just saying how much I've enjoyed listening to your experiences. I was particularly interested in your responses to Rachel's question. It's something I know that Rachel and I have spoken about at Warwick before. And Dipali, I suppose if I was to formulate a single question, it would be, I was really interested that your experience of cinema was mediated through television, or rather through VHS. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think we do tend to think of cinema as being something that we sort of go out to consume in the cinema. And my personal experience is also most of the film I watched growing up was through sort of via television, by way of VHS. So I just wondered if you could say anything else about that.
Thanks, Richard. I just about caught it there. I think just a little bit about the VHS experience. Is that right? Yeah, I mean, that whole thing of watching films on the small screen, that was normal. So for the first time to go into a cinema, which it's the second film I ever watched growing up in Burnley, I went to the cinema to watch Back to the Future, and it was just like, whoa, big screen. But anything else was like, no, my father was like, you're not going to watch it in the cinema. You can wait 3 years till it comes on television. So that was how we grew up. It's like, you're not going to the cinema. You watch it for TV on free. So watching Indian cinema on the small screen, it was only until my 20s, Richard, that I saw films on the big screen from South Asian cinema. Can you imagine that? Sort of that whole thing of like watching it for like however many years, and then, oh, that's what it's supposed to look like. That's what it's supposed to sound like. But as I say, it was such an important link to my heritage and background, and just to have it there on that small screen and to see it and then understand it via, when I say the BBC then presented it on the TV, it was hacked to bits, but the fact it had subtitles, they were just like a lifeline. But because as a Bengali speaker, a lot of the films are in Hindustani, so I was just like you, going, what are they saying? I didn't have a clue, you know. So that watching, and that it was a family thing, and I can't emphasize enough, women, a lot of the time, they just didn't stop working. They were running households, they were working at home, they just didn't stop. So I knew it was a big deal that to have a film coming into our home. And that was the one time that we really, really just enjoyed being together. Unless, you know, obviously you have to go to the parks and whatever, but the importance of coming together. And I think for my parents as well, the older films that we talked about from the golden era, it just took them back to their homeland. And that was very evocative and very emotional. And I'll stop before I do as well. So thank you.
Richard, in response, I just want to kind of also, I want to give you an experience of my summers as a kid, right? So we had, we recorded like almost we recorded loads of films. So, you know, we had all the James Bond films, we had the Back to the Futures, we had Goonies, we had Star Wars, we had, you know, anything that came on television that was kind of family, or and some things that were a bit older as well. It was recorded. And we had all these Indian films as well. So we practically would spend our summer, me and my brothers, because we weren't allowed out, only in the garden, because we weren't allowed out, we would spend our summer afternoons during the summer holidays watching a film, and we would plan like, okay, we're going to do James Bond today, okay, we're going to do Indiana Jones today. And so the VHS recorder in our household was really important, you know, because we'd watch, so this is how our summer holiday schedule was. We'd watch the kids programming, Why Don't You, in the morning till Neighbours came on. We'd eat lunch watching Neighbours, and then after Neighbours we'd watch a film, and then by which time you had the Broom Cupboard, kids programming on, and then Neighbours. So, you know, our entire summer holiday, because everybody was working, my parents didn't take time off, we wouldn't go on holiday. So for 6 weeks, this was our schedule, whilst my dad had a shop. So a lot of that program with the shop was like, oh my God, that's what it was like. So my dad would be downstairs in the shop, we'd be upstairs in the lounge, and just basically revolved around the television. So yeah, so I think it is really important, this, like the VHS, and well, this is why I've got square eyes, Elke. This is why I've got square eyes. So yeah, so I think it's really important. But there was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was now. But I forgot. Yeah, I've forgotten. But I just wanted to kind of share that experience of like how the VHS and television was, for me and my brothers, was very important.
Can I just add on to that, the whole thing about watching British film, just British films on British TV, and like as I get a bit older, but yeah, we did get to go out. We were 70s kids. We were sent out with a rich tea biscuit, and you were out for the rest of the day. And that I am so lucky. I feel so lucky that I got to do that. You go out in the morning and come back home like 4 or 5. Someone's mum would say time for tea, and then you'd all go, because you had no one had a watch. But Gregory's Girl, I just want to say quickly, my friend was like, I'm going to watch Gregory's Girl tonight. And I said, this is Channel 4 when it first started, and it's showing all these amazing films. I was like, I'm going to watch it too, because I love films. And then I begged and begged and begged, because it started at 9, and I'm like at junior school still. And I was like, oh, okay then. And that opening scene, I don't know if you remember, they're sitting in a tree watching someone and begging for her to take a brassiere off. And my mother was like, what is this film? And she was just like, get upstairs to bed right now. And I still to this day have not watched it. So I need to do that. So that's the experience of just watching everyday television. So I need to watch it.
How wonderful to realize that we all have, even though we have different experiences, we also have a lot of experiences in common, including Dipali. Even though I grew up a little bit later than you, I was sent out all day in summer as well. But that's the nice thing about Germany, or not the nice thing about Germany, because in Germany, the maximum any child is still allowed to watch television is 10 minutes a day. 10 minutes. Otherwise, you get square eyes, right? So, yes. So anyway, I'm really aware that we're already out of time, but can I ask everyone to thank our speakers for their really interesting insights, and I think they've given us a lot to take forward, and thank you also for the questions, which I think has also given us a lot to take forward.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having it. Thank you for organising, Elke. Great conference, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Really good.
Elke, can I just have a quick word?